A school of alienists, slightly less academic than Dr. Lyman's assign to Ward's European trip, the beginning of his true madness, admitting that he was sane when he started. They believe that his conduct upon returning implies a disastrous change. But even to this claim, Dr. Willett refuses to accede. There was, he insists, something later, and the queerness of the youth at this stage he attributes to the practice of rituals learned abroad. Odd enough things, to be sure, by no means implying mental aberration on the part of their celebrant. Ward himself, though visibly aged and hardened, was still normal in his general reactions, and in several talks with Willett displayed a balance which no madman, even an incipient one, could feign continuously for long. What elicited the notion of insanity at this period were the sounds heard at all hours from Ward's attic laboratory, in which he kept himself most of the time. Well, maybe he's just enjoying himself. Doesn't mean you're crazy. Which he kept himself most of the time. There were chantings and repetitions and thunderous declamations in uncanny rhythms, and although these sounds were always in Ward's own voice, there was something in the quality of that voice, and the accents of the formula it pronounced, which could not but chill the blood of every hearer. It was noticed that Nig, the venerable and beloved black cat of the household, brisked and arched his back perceptibly when certain of the tones were heard. Now, the Martian and the jovial use of voice are essential techniques. Just because people can't, aren't willing to go through the steps, doesn't mean it's some evil use of voice or something. The odors occasionally wafted from the laboratory were likewise exceedingly strange. Sometimes they were very noxious, but more often they were aromatic, with a haunting, elusive quality which seemed to have the power of inducing fantastic images. People who smelled them had a tendency to glimpse momentary mirages of enormous vistas, with strange hills or endless avenues of sphinxes and hippogriffs stretching off into infinite distance. Ward did not resume his old-time rambles, but applied himself diligently to the strange books he had brought home, and to equally strange delvings within his quarters, explaining that European sources had greatly enlarged the possibilities of his work and promised great revelations in the years to come. His older aspect increased to a startling degree his resemblance to the Curwen portrait in his library, and Dr. Willett would often pause by the latter after a call, marveling at the virtual identity and reflecting that only the small pit above the pitcher's right eye now remained to differentiate the long-dead wizard from the living youth. These calls of Dr. Willett's, undertaken at the request of the senior wards, were curious affairs. Ward at no time repulsed the doctor, but the latter saw that he could never reach the young man's inner psychology. Frequently he noted peculiar things about little wax images of grotesque designs on the shelves or tables, and the half-erased remnants of circles, triangles, and pentagrams in chalk or charcoal on the cleared central space of the large room. And always, in the night, those rhythms and incantations thundered, till it became very difficult to keep servants or suppress furtive talk of Charles's madness. In January of 1927, a peculiar incident occurred one night about midnight, as Charles was chanting a ritual whose weird cadence echoed unpleasantly throughout the house below. There came a sudden gust of chill wind from the bay, and a faint, obscure trembling of the earth, which everyone in the neighborhood noticed. At the same time, the cat exhibited phenomenal traces of fright, while dogs bayed for as much as a mile around. This was the prelude to a sharp thunderstorm anomalous for the season, which brought with it such a crash that Mr. and Mrs. Ward believed the house had been struck. They rushed upstairs to see what damage had been done, but Charles met them at the door to the attic, pale, resolute, and portentous, with an almost fearsome combination of triumph and seriousness on his face. He assured them that the house had not really been struck, and that the storm would soon be over. They paused, and looking through the window, saw that he was indeed right, for the lightning flashed farther and farther off, whilst the trees ceased to bend in the strange frigid gust from the water. The thunder sank to a sort of dull, mumbling chuckle, and finally died away. Stars came out, and the stamp of triumph on Charles Ward's face crystallized into a very singular expression. For 2 months or more after this incident, Ward was less confined than usual to his laboratory. He exhibited a curious interest in the weather, and made odd inquiries about the date of the spring thawing of the ground. One late night in March, he left the house after midnight and did not return till almost morning, when his mother, being wakeful, heard a rumbling motor draw up to the carriage entrance. Muffled oaths could be distinguished, and Mrs. Ward, rising and going to the window, saw 4 dark figures removing a long, heavy box from a trunk at Charles's direction and carrying it within. By the side door, she heard labored breathing and ponderous footfalls on the stairs, and finally a dull thumping in the attic, after which the footfalls descended again, and the 4 men reappeared outside and drove off in their truck. The next day Charles resumed his strict attic seclusion, drawing down the dark shades of his laboratory windows, and appearing to be working on some metal substance. He would open the door to no one, and steadfastly refused all proffered food. About noon, a wrenching sound, followed by a terrible cry and a fall, were heard. But when Mrs. Ward rapped at the door, her son at length answered faintly, and told her that nothing had gone amiss. The hideous and indescribable stench, now welling out, was absolutely harmless and unfortunately necessary. Solitude was the only prime essential, and he would appear later for dinner. That afternoon, after the conclusion of some odd hissing sounds which came from behind the locked portal, he did not finally appear, wearing an extremely haggard aspect, and forbidding anyone to enter the laboratory upon any pretext. This indeed proved the beginning of a new policy of secrecy, for never afterward was any person permitted to visit either the mysterious garret workroom or the adjacent storeroom, which he cleaned out, furnished roughly, and added to his inviolably private domain as a sleeping apartment. Here he lived, with books brought up from his library beneath, till the time he purchased the Pawtuxet bungalow and moved to it all his scientific effects. In the evening, Charles secured the paper before the rest of the family, and damaged part of it through an apparent accident. Later on, Dr. Willett, having fixed a date from statements by various members of the household, looked up an intact copy at the journal office and found that, in the destroyed section, the following small item had occurred: Nocturnal diggers surprised in North Burial Ground. Robert Hart, night watchman at the North Burial Ground, this morning discovered a party of several men with a motor truck in the oldest part of the cemetery, but apparently frightened them off before they had accomplished whatever their object may have been. The discovery took place about 4 o'clock, when Hart's attention was attracted by the sound of a motor outside his shelter. Investigating, he saw a large truck on the main drive several rods away, but could not reach it before the sound of his feet on the gravel had revealed his approach. The men hastily placed a large box in the truck and drove away toward the street before they could be overtaken, and since no known grave was disturbed, Hart believes that this box was an object which they wished to bury. The diggers must have been at work for a long while before detection, for Hart found an enormous hole dug at a considerable distance back from the roadway in the lot of Amosa Field, where most of the old stones have long ago disappeared. The hole, a place as large and deep as a grave, was empty, and did not coincide with any interment mentioned in the cemetery records. Sergeant Riley, at the second station, viewed the spot and gave the opinion that the hole was dug by bootleggers, rather gruesomely and ingeniously seeking a safe catch for liquor in a place not likely to be disturbed. In reply to questions, Hart said he thought the escaping truck had headed up Rochambeau Avenue, though he could not be sure. During the last few days, Charles Ward was seldom seen by his family. Having added sleeping quarters to his attic realm, he kept clearly to himself there, ordering food brought to the door and not taking it in until after the servant had gone away. The droning of monotonous formula and the chanting of bizarre rhythms occurred at intervals, while at other times occasional listeners could detect the sound of tinkling glass, hissing chemicals and running water, or roaring gas flames. Odors of the most unplaceable quality, wholly unlike any before noted, hung at times around the door, and the air of tension observable in the young recluse, whenever he did venture briefly forth, was such as to excite the keenest speculation. Once he made a hasty trip to the Athenaeum for a book he required, and again he hired a messenger to fetch him a highly obscure volume from Boston. Suspense was written portentously over a whole situation, and both the family and Dr. Willett confessed themselves wholly at a loss what to do or think about it.